Semester number 2, lesson number 30. Our aim today is why were the arms race and space race important aspects of the Cold War. And really, what we're focusing on here is the competition the United States and the Soviet Union had in literally every aspect of society, from not only military but to the space race. And anything that they could compete in, they would. And that's what we're going to talk about today. The 3 points we're going to talk about are the space race, the Bay of Pigs invasion, and the Cuban Missile Crisis. The space race was really a competition between the Soviet Union and the United States uh, in A, getting a satellite in space, B, getting a person in space, and C, getting someone on the moon. And if we look at why the space race was so important, both sides realized the importance of monitoring and surveillance, and they thought that if they had satellites in space, they could, monitor each other, and that could be, an advantage they would have over the other country. So in 1957, the Soviet Union becomes the first country to put a satellite into orbit. The satellite is known as Sputnik, very important satellite. They also, 4 years later, put the first human in space. All right, a Soviet named Yuri Gagarin. He's the first to go into orbit. So the Soviets put the first satellite in space, and they put the first person in space. However, the United States on July 16th, 1969, is going to put the first man on the moon, and that's Neil Armstrong. And he famously says, "One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." Um, when you see, the concept of putting a man on the moon, it was not only impressive from the fact of what America did, but it also it showed them as being the most powerful and technologically advanced country of the time. It was a real show of the power they had over the Soviet Union and the advantages they had over the Soviet Union. The Bay of Pigs invasion. Now, when we talk about the United States and this policy of containment, um, it got a little bit harder when Cuba became communist under Fidel Castro. And in 1961, the new U.S. president is John F. Kennedy, and he saw the importance of getting rid of communism in Cuba. Cuba is only about 90 miles off the coast of Miami, so it's very close to the United States. And with that policy of containment, they want to ensure that communism does not spread into the United States. So in '61, Kennedy supports an invasion of Cuba by anti-Castro supporters. Basically, the United States took all these Cubans that had escaped from communist Cuba and came to America, and they put them into training with the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency. They were trained to rebel against Castro and overthrow his regime, because Fidel Castro was a communist dictator in Cuba. They trained all these men, and then they brought them back to Cuba to try to fight, um, to overthrow Castro. The invasion failed terribly, and the anti-Castro troops were slaughtered. Castro viewed this invasion as evidence that the U.S. was working actively to overthrow his communist government, and that is really when our relationship with Cuba becomes incredibly cold. From that point forward, Castro worked very, very closely with the Soviets, and now America has a problem with not only communism in the Eastern Hemisphere, but now within the Western Hemisphere, 90 miles off the coast of their country. And this becomes really a very big embarrassment for the United States. Not only is it embarrassment in terms of the fact that they failed, but the fact that that 90 miles from their coast, there is a small communist country that they cannot get rid of. And the CIA failed miserably, and this made them look, it was a big embarrassment. So, some talking points dealing with that. Why do you think the Bay of Pigs invasion is often referred to as an American failure? How did this failure make America look? And the second question, do you believe Kennedy and the United States made the right choice in authorizing the Bay of Pigs invasion? Why or why not? And this is just a picture of the Bay of Pigs invasion. All right, these are the captured um, uh, soldiers that the CIA had trained to go back and fight. All right, many of them were captured. Over 160 of them were killed, I believe. And the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Cuban Missile Crisis, which happens basically the following year, from October 16th to October 28th, 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis is incredibly important. Underline it, star it, highlight it, whatever you got to do. This is the closest the United States and the Soviet Union come to direct confrontation. All right, it was a confrontation between the Soviet Union and the United States regarding the deployment of nuclear missiles in Cuba. In early 1961, the United States, who was allies with Turkey, began placing missiles in Turkey in a direction that was pointed towards the Soviet Union. Then the Soviet Union was very uncomfortable with this and made that well known. And in early 62, the Soviet Union places nuclear missiles in Cuba, where Fidel Castro was in control and very angry after the Bag of Pigs, all right, which is 90 miles from the coast of Miami. Now, at this point, basically, the United States has weapons in Turkey pointed at the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union has weapons in Cuba pointed at the United States. Here's a map, all right, of where the missiles were located in Cuba, all right, and also on the bottom there you see the site of the Bay of Pigs invasion from the year before. There's 3 missile sites, all right, and if you could see here, if Florida is 90 miles off the coast, all 3 of those missile sites are easily within range of Florida and more north towards Washington D.C. All right. And here are the 3 players in the Cuban Missile Crisis. You have John F. Kennedy in the top left, Fidel Castro in the middle there, and Khrushchev, who was the leader of the Soviet Union, in the right. Solving the crisis. So really, for 2 weeks, all right, both sides lived in fear that there was going to be a nuclear war, and this was the closest, as we said, to a war between the two sides, coming to happen. The Soviets offer to withdraw the missiles under the promise that the U.S. will remove their missiles in Turkey and agree not to invade Cuba. All right. JFK agrees to these terms, and the crisis ends without any missiles being set off. The Cuban Missile Crisis is the closest these two superpowers came to nuclear war. And over these 2 weeks, all right, there was a lot of stress in the United States. People were not sure when they left for work that morning if, they would ever see their family again. Who knows what would have happened? So there was really this fear that something could happen at any moment. Um, it was a very stressful time, and there's a movie. It's called 13 Days with Kevin Costner, and it really talks. It's a good movie if you have some time this summer. It's all about the nuclear this kind of nuclear threat that the United States endured during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and how the whole country was at was stressed out and worried about what was going to happen next. So we have 2 check for understanding today. The first is the immediate impact of the 1957 launch of Sputnik 1 was that it A. forced the United States to find new sources of fuel, B. focused attention on the need to regulate the uses of outer space, C. heightened the space race as a form of Cold War competition, or D. ended the period of peaceful coexistence between the United States and the Soviet Union. And we'll talk about the answer tomorrow in class. And the second check for understanding. President John F. Kennedy supported the 1961 Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba as an effort to 1. remove a communist dictator from power, 2. stop the flow of illegal drugs into the United States, 3. support Fidel Castro's efforts for reform, or 4. rescue hostages held by Cuban freedom fighters. And we will talk about that tomorrow as well. Have a good night.